as a psychotherapist or a counselor, it's incredibly important that we don't collude in the client's attempt to be dehumanized, because we are fundamentally human. And that's what I offer as a therapist. I offer, the human connection.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Stella O'Malley, joining me from Dublin, Ireland. She is a psychotherapist, director of Genspect, co-host of Beyond Gender. Her books include Cotton Wool Kids, Bully-Proof Kids, Fragile, What Your Teen is Trying to Tell You, and she also is co-author of When Kids Say They're Trans and a contributor to the book Cynical Therapies. So this is quite an impressive resume, and I'm very glad you're here to join me. So welcome, Stella.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So let's start off. Tell me a little bit about who you are and what your background is.
Well, when I was a child, I suffered for quite a few years of wanting to be a boy, and it lasted quite a few years. It was a long, long time ago. And, in the 70s, 90s Ireland, nobody was bringing me off to the doctor, even though I was an odd kid. I was a weird kid, but that's all it was. And, I was born female, and I'm very glad I didn't take the concept of medical transition as an option that was for me. From then on, as the years went by, I ultimately became comfortable in my own skin, and I ended up, perfectly happy as being a woman, even though I still think I would have been a great boy. I went on and life went on, and I didn't give it an awful lot more thought. It did last for very many years of my childhood, and it did make puberty harrowing, a very distressing experience. It did kind of shape my understanding of anybody. Whenever I met somebody who medically transitioned, I saw them as somebody who had been like me and who had got stuck, just like somebody else might have OCD and recover from it, and they meet somebody else with OCD in adulthood and they think, oh, I had that as a kid and I see you've got stuck. So that's how I viewed it all my life. But I didn't give it an awful lot of thought in my 20s and 30s. And when I was in my 30s, I studied to become a psychotherapist. Nothing to do with trans issues. I was interested in general psychology. I was an unhappy kid, which I do think probably contributed to that sense of gender dysphoria that I would have had. But anyway, became qualified as a psychotherapist and wrote some books, which you've been named, about mental health, about parenting, about childhood. I was a mother, and it's the most important part of me, is being a mother. And I was very concerned about parenting, and I was also very concerned about the mental health industry. And I wrote a book called Fragile around that, just kind of thinking we're losing our way in mental health. It's become a product, and it's making an awful lot of people feel disempowered, an awful lot of parents not feel that they're an authority on their children. And somewhere along the way, I wrote an article about gender issues, not realizing it was going to change my life. This was in 2017. I got invited to become a presenter of a film called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk in 2018. And the idea about the film was, what about kids like me who grow up and become completely comfortable in their own skin? Where are they in this narrative of all these children are suffering pain like no other and need to medicalize immediately? Because I didn't medicalize, and I'm very glad I didn't. So where are they in the narrative? So that was the idea of the film. And for that, I was vilified and called transphobic and cancelled on every level. This was way back in 2018. I tried to continue just being a general psychotherapist after that. And, I could try to kind of just move on and, not become obsessed with trans. But I was inundated by emails from people looking for help, and they were from everybody. It was people who were distressed that they'd medically transitioned and they wished they hadn't. I kind of called them the lost in transition kind of category. They were from people who wanted to medically transition but were intrigued by my film, which kind of suggested that recovery was possible. And they were from parents who were worried sick about their children, who were generally very vulnerable, autistic, OCD, ADHD kids, who had decided that medical transition was the way forward for them. So it was kind of different cohorts. And then in March 2020, because of COVID, I had suddenly had time to myself like everybody. And I started giving parent groups for these parents who were so concerned about their children, because I just thought nobody's looking after them, and they were consistently asking me for help. So I said, yeah, I'll give a few parent groups, not knowing that this was genuinely going to be a game changer. I'll never forget that first meeting with those parents and just how devastated and alone and isolated they were. and how nobody was looking after their kids and the doctors weren't treating their kids properly and everybody was sending them towards medical transition. And these were really vulnerable, lost kids. And from that, ultimately, I founded Genspect in 2021, and it's become a huge international organisation that is advocating for a non-medicalised approach to gender dysphoria because of obviously the reasons I've just listed, that there's other ways to recover from feeling like you shouldn't have been born in this body and from feeling alienated from your own body. And so that's what we advocate for, and it's become a very large organisation now.
Yeah, I want you to tell me more about Genspect here in a second, but the advice that you're giving and kind of the general message and mission of Genspect is quite contrary to the mainstream of medicine and psychotherapy at the moment. I think that the primary advice, I guess you'd say, of Genspect is watchful waiting, I think.
Depending on, very individualistic. We would kind of sometimes say watchful waiting because let's say young kids, 3, 4, 5, 6, they don't need any interventions. Just look after them. But the children who are teenagers, watchful waiting isn't probably enough because they are often online all the time. And so if you're just waiting, and they won't come out of it because they'll go deeper in because they're indoctrinating themselves online. So we would have more interventions around get them outside, help them build their social skills, help them build their friendships in whatever way possible, expand their world beyond their bedroom. These are online children who need to be helped to move into real life. So I don't think it's strong enough really for the older kids.
But you would say, generally speaking, your goal is to move kids and teens away from this idea of medical transition.
Yeah, we're positively pro a non-medicalized approach. And that approach could be psychosocial, it could be psychological, it could be watchful waiting, it could be low interventionist, but it won't be medical because we don't believe medical transition it's not supported by long-term quality evidence, and we think it's a failed medical intervention that really isn't supporting a long-term healthy outcome.
So this is contrary to a lot of what I'm seeing in mainstream psychology, medicine. My own grad program has essentially said the only appropriate type of care for these type of kids and adolescents is gender-affirming care. The type of messages you hear are the worst thing you can do is nothing. And would you rather have a dead son or a live daughter? This is kind of they're presenting it as though all of the science and medical evidence is on their side, and there's this moral imperative to take action. How would you respond to that?
I think when people speak about suicide, it's imperative that they are very accurate and they're very careful because suicide is a tragedy in anybody's family. And so we have to be very, very cautious and make sure that we are, informing people accurately when we speak about it. And when you look at the actual data, rather than people's fears, the actual data shows that, like, for example, between 2010 and 2020, 15,000 children were either on a waiting list or being treated by the Gender Identity Development Services, the largest paediatric gender clinic in the world at the time, in the Tavistock in London. And of those 15,000 children, 4 died by suicide on the waiting list and 2 were being treated with gender-affirming care. So it's kind of equal whether they were being treated or they weren't. But 4 out of 15,000 is not an elevated rate of suicide among vulnerable youth. And these are vulnerable youth. And so if you compare this with anxiety or autism or OCD or other ADHD, you'll see that it's pretty much on a par with other vulnerable youths. So it isn't an elevated statistic. When you put that statistic with another piece of evidence that, again, only I'm interested in long-term quality evidence. And the other piece of kind of long-term quality evidence that we have is among adults who've transitioned. And the long-term quality evidence from 2011 this is, and it followed people over a 40-year period in Sweden. Now, Sweden was one of the most pioneering, it is the most pioneering for medical transition. They pulled back recently, but they pioneered medical transition among children and among adults. And they brought out, they looked at the deaths and they realised that for people who have medically transitioned, these are not people who are on waiting lists as children, these are adults who have medically transitioned, they're 19 times more likely to die by suicide post-medical transition. So therefore, if you look at the two facts, you're looking at one, it's not elevated, it's just on a par with other vulnerable youth. That's pre-medical transition. And then post-medical transition, it is actually elevated. So medical transition is not a cure-all. In fact, medical transition contributes to a risk factor to make it more likely that you might die by suicide. Now, I say that very carefully. I'm not weaponizing it. I'm just pointing to the data that we have. I think it's a myth has gone along that this is some sort of, if people don't, would you rather a live trans kid or a dead kid? This is hysterical, inaccurate, misinformed, highly irresponsible sloganeering that people are using because they are pro-medical transition. And it has to be combated as vigorously as possible. So I take real issue with anybody who say things like that. As well as that, I think we've got to kind of give room for the fact that, people need to look at this through a psychological lens, and presuming that high medical intervention is the right approach, that has been questioned for all sorts of issues that lie in within mental distress. For example, ADHD medicine. At first, everybody thought it was, the best medicine possible for people who are diagnosed with ADHD. And now people are saying, well, actually, this is more complicated than initially thought. Yes, they might feel great at the beginning. There might be great results. They might sit in school and they might perform better in school. But in the long term, the results are not looking great for long-term use of ADHD medication. And I know people write in and say, my child was on ADHD and it was the best thing. There's always going to be exceptions. I perfectly acknowledge that. I'm just saying, as a medical intervention, heavy intervention in the psychology of a person, it's the long-term evidence is paltry. And until we have quality long-term evidence, we need to look at the least invasive first approaches. And we need to kind of prioritize the least invasive first approaches, i.e. psychological help, psychosocial supports, kind of practical supports in the child's life before we go into more highly interventionist approaches.
So from what I can tell, vast majority of the evidence is on your side, and I believe you, but I'm getting a very different message from what I say from mainstream psychology, as well as my graduate program. Like you mentioned, a lot of this gender confusion could be caused by a pre-existing mental illness. And what I've been taught in my program is that you're not supposed to look for any other cause. Like, trans is the root cause of everything. There's no other reason why a kid would identify that way. So there's no use in going below the surface. This is the primary thing that needs to be treated, and the treatment is gender-affirming care. But you're saying there's something more under the surface, right?
Yeah, the level of comorbidities among this cohort is sky high. They're highly likely to have anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism, OCD, eating disorders. They have other conditions. Now, when they're young children, it's not as likely. When they're young children, it's much more likely that they'd be gay, lesbian, or bisexual when they're older. When they're teenagers, it's much more likely that they have other significant mental health challenges. And that they, as a lonely, lost, distressed teenager, they go online, they discover the concept of transgender, and they realize something is lit inside them. They realize, I could be a different person with a different name, and I could take medication and I won't even look like myself. And nobody will be able to refer to that old person. They'll only be able to refer to the new, cool person that might be very like that YouTube influencer that I watch all the time. This is what these vulnerable and naive, and they are mostly naive and gullible kids, are falling into. This kind of false promise that they can be a different person. And, there's a great book by, the guru of mindfulness, Wherever You Go, There You Are. And what happens is they medically transition, but underneath they're still the anxious, distressed, person that they've always been. And so there might be a bump, there might be a kind of a spike of happiness, because getting what you want and being offered a new life is very heady, it's very exciting. Being on hormones, for example, testosterone for a female, you've got a huge amount of energy, you feel stronger, you have much higher libido. It really is a hell of it's like cocaine for these young girls. It's really, really powerful drug. So there's a spike. They feel great for a while, but then some years on testosterone, they get, continuous UTIs, they get a huge amount of pain on orgasm. So the high libido is a massive source of frustration because it's too painful for them. And they end up in pain. And so what was great at the beginning, which is very like a lot of drugs, great at the beginning, then over time the whole thing cracks and it's not fun anymore and it's not great anymore and it's actually devastating. But they want more of it because they remember the feeling of feeling so powerful. So it's a very complicated procedure and process to medically transition. And this idea that it's supported by evidence just because psychotherapy has lost its way, and it has, doesn't mean that we should disregard the clinical evidence. And the clinical evidence shows that the long-term outcomes, we've got very little data, but the data we do have suggests much more likely to be admitted into a psychiatric hospital, much more likely to be in prison, much more likely to have mental health issues, and much more likely to die by suicide. They are the long-term medical health outcomes and higher likely for anxiety and depression and other issues. Now, this is a vulnerable population to start with, so yes, they would have these elevated outcomes, but we really suggest that this is a healthy intervention. It's just not supported. An awful lot of people are relying on a chain of trust. They presume that what they're being told is correct and informed. And when I first got into trans issues, I was looking at this research saying, oh, this is a surprise. Oh, it says it's all very healthy. And then I started penetrating the literature and I realized, oh, wait, hang on. The follow-up is 6 months. Like, as I remember saying, this is very early into it. I'd written an article in 2017 about it. And some trans activists wrote in saying, here's some evidence to show this is a great intervention. And I was like, well, I don't care how you feel after 6 months after an intervention. I literally think it's kind of irrelevant. I want to know, how do you feel 6 months, 6 years after an intervention? Then I'll be able to know whether this is a decent intervention. 6 months is 6 weeks is it's shallow, and 6 months is shallow. We need a long, a long-term result like 6 years. And so when I realized that the medical literature that is supporting this is very shoddy, for example, they have a huge amount of laws to follow up. So they might say, 80% of the participants in this study were happy with the intervention. One, you're relying on self-report, which is notoriously flawed. But two, 40% of the participants have dropped out of the study. And it's like, oh, so 80% of the participants, but 40% have dropped out. And I'm sorry to be giving so many numbers, but that's a very flawed study. That is not a good study, and it's not held up with good quality evidence. So Hilary Cass is a paediatric consultant in the UK. And in 2020, she was just coming, she's highly eminent, very prestigious woman. And she was coming towards the end of her career. And she thought, she'd be just studying this every Thursday for a couple of months and then she'd move on. And she was asked to study gender-affirming. I laugh because it changed her life. She was asked to study, gender-affirming care and to, produce a report. She was completely neutral. She had no skin in the game. She was just a very prestigious paediatric consultant. And she carried out a research project. And she had a team from York University to help her with this. And it ended up being a full-time job with her team for 4 years. And they studied, it's the best quality, comprehensive, systematic review of gender-affirming care in the world. And for 4 years they studied it between 2020 and 2024. And what they came out with is there is no high-quality supporting evidence to support these interventions. There is nothing to support these interventions. This is a reckless, it's not even an experiment because we don't have a control group, but these are reckless interventions that are not supported but are being presumed to be supported. And what we need is some kind of least invasive first kind of approaches. She gave 32 recommendations in a report saying, let's try this, let's try that, let's try the other. And in some of it she was looking for, let's get more high quality data. So she was very neutral. She was not somebody who, like me, would have a position and say, these are failed medical interventions, haven't studied all. I've looked at every age. I'm not interested in just children. I just don't think it's supported. But she has eminence And she is saying, no, 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 no. Gender affirming care is not supported in the way that people presume it's supported. So I encourage anybody who's surprised by this is to look into the evidence, look at the Cass review, and you'll see in the Cass, this is Hilary Cass's work, you'll see how meticulous it is and how she looked at the the support, let's say, for puberty blockers. This blocks all sexual development in children. And she realized there's nothing sustainable to kind of rely on to be able to give these highly radical, invasive interventions on children. And as a result, puberty blockers have been banned in the UK, and the gender identity clinic that I mentioned earlier has been kind of closed, and now 5 centres have been opened up around the regions. And, they're trying to change it in the UK, but the very deep assertion that this is primary health care seems to have been kind of imbued into the psyche, and people presume it's okay. And I think a lot of the rot happened in academia, where an awful lot of shoddy papers were peer-reviewed and allowed to go through. And psychology, which I think yourself and myself are most interested in, we've lost our way because, when I was becoming a psychotherapist, I learned about, we offer a therapeutic process, and the process might involve an awful lot of pain, and it might be very challenging, but it's a process, and it's worthwhile, and it has value. But in many levels, for example, in gender affirming care, the therapeutic process has turned into basically therapeutic support. And so rather than offering a process, I'm positioned to be offering psychological support, i.e. I will support the person in whatever they will do. And that's not what I signed up to. I'm a psychotherapist. I offer a process, and that is not necessarily supporting the person in everything they do. So there's been a sleight of hand over the last 20 years over what is psychology, what is a psychotherapeutic process, and what are we offering? And very often people say, wouldn't you look for support? Why don't you look for mental health support? And I'm like, that has demeaned what we offered as psychotherapists and psychologists, and we've allowed it happen. Now, I studied in, the early 2000s, and I noticed, to my surprise when I was studying it, that this wasn't an intellectual group of people. These were very kind, almost nurse-like people were my colleagues or my fellow students, very kind, very empathic, very attuned to kind of gentleness. And I remember thinking, that's not what I expected. I expected intellectual rigor. And I expected a kind of a deep interest in the psyche and what might be going on. And I think now, all these years later, I realize, it had moved beyond an intellectually challenging process by then. And we were being positioned to effectively just give support, give affirmation to whoever's in front of you. So that is dangerous. If you think about the client who comes into me and she might say, I want to move to Alaska. And I could think, well, that is a radical move. You live in Ireland. Are you sure about moving to Alaska? No, what's going to happen to your children? Maybe we should explore this. As a psychotherapist, I would offer a process around that. Let's look at the pros and cons. Let's look at the long term. Let's look at the short term. Let's look at what might be driving this. Let's look at radical decisions. There's lots of things you can do in psychotherapy within this context. The very same as if she says, I'm leaving my husband. I would do the very same. I wouldn't just immediately say, yes, I affirm everything you do and off you go and let me help you get tickets to Alaska, because that would be demeaning the psychotherapeutic process, but it would also be demeaning the fact that when somebody comes for psychotherapy, they're vulnerable. There's something wrong. And so they're looking for guidance and help and support and challenge in where they're at. They're not just looking for support, they're looking for a lot of things. And so gender affirmative care doesn't give any of that. That just affirms. It affirms the client. So they say, I want to medically transition. And Path, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, they've positioned the psychotherapists as facilitators. So we facilitate the medical transition. So somebody comes in, maybe you're a child psychotherapist, and the 5-year-old comes in saying they want to be a boy and she's born a girl. And you immediately facilitate it. You say, will I contact the parents? Will I contact the schools? Will I help you become a boy to the eyes of the world? Or if they're 14, will I help you get puberty blockers to stop your sexual development? And will I help you access other interventions to promote a medical transition? It's an extraordinary change of what is the psychological process. And it has happened without very much comment. It's happened just like in increments without people realizing it, until suddenly we've been demoted into, we have the Samaritans over here. Do you have kind of like these phone lines where people just ring up looking for support in the middle of the night?
Yes.
Yeah. So we've been kind of effectively, psychotherapists have been effectively, and psychologists, demoted into helplines where we just make kind of, very affirming noises. We don't challenge anything. We just go, oh, that must be very hard. Okay. It's very sympathetic, but it's got no depth to it.
It seems like, I think this, I guess, customer's always right mentality of affirming care is kind of troubling generally, but I don't see that with everything though. If you had a depressed client who said, I don't think my life is worth living, I want to take my life, a therapist wouldn't affirm that. Or if you had an anorexic client who is severely underweight and said, I want liposuction, you wouldn't affirm that. But for some reason with this trans issue, it's in this higher level of like a holy and sacred place that you're not allowed to question.
It's a very good point, but I'd like people to stick a pin in that point, because they've started to bring in a concept, for example, in Canada and other places, called terminal anorexia, where they're saying that people can go for assisted dying because they've got a concept, I know, called terminal anorexia. I know. And if you just pause and think about that, it could be applied to terminal depression. It's frightening, but it's basically saying, we accept that this person won't get better, and if they want to go forward towards assisted dying, this is something that we can facilitate. Basically, if you were to get to the heart of what's going on, there's an argument emerging between rights-based medicine and evidence-based medicine. And so some people, for example, the World Health Organization, advocate for rights-based medicine, as in you are the consumer, you are the personal with personal autonomy, and you have the right to access whatever medicine you want, be it gender-affirming care or, assisted dying or whatever else. While if it's evidence-based medicine, you look at the evidence, you position the clinician as the expert who offers an intervention that is evidence-based. It's completely different, and therefore withholds, for example, liposuction for the anorexic. But this is creeping in. Rights-based medicine is creeping in, and it's creeping in quite fast. So I'd say if we met in a few years, you won't so confidently say that about anorexia and, for example, Ozempic for anorexics. There is things creeping in. Yeah, there is things creeping in where it's basically, it's my personal autonomy matters more than your evidence-based care. And it's, like I say, it's rights-based versus evidence-based, and it's at the heart of what this argument is all about. Does the person have the right to insist on the care that they want, or does the clinician have the right to insist on the care that they recommend? Who's got the right here? Who is appropriate? When it comes to children, it gets, of course, more complicated. Does the state have the right to insist on the care that they believe this child needs? Does the child have the right to insist on the care that they need? Or does the parent have the right to insist on the care that they think should be right for this child? Who has the right in this? Like, this is a Venn diagram of rights, and we are really in an extraordinary place with medicine. And I think people are sleepwalking into a lot of things that are going on.
This is so bizarre to me. For quite a few years, we've been told the science is settled. And transgender activists said all of the medical and psychological research is on our side. And I think if you were kind of like maybe a well-meaning person and you didn't really dig deep into the research, you kind of see all the major organizations supporting it and you think, okay, this must be a good thing. But in the past few years, we've had, as you mentioned, big literature reviews coming out of Scandinavia, the Cass report coming out of the UK. You've got the WPATH files, which have been very damning, showing that some of the leading experts knew the harm that they were causing. Have these new pieces of evidence shifted the perception of the field at all in your eyes?
Yeah, there's definitely shifts. People aren't as confident as they once were, and the trans activists are becoming arguably more fringe. They always were fringe. They just got welcomed in from the fringes in the last 10 years as the rights-based medicine started to come to the fore. And, like you say, Scandinavia has really withdrawn from gender-affirming care in many ways and put in a lot of restrictions. around gender affirming care for children. That would be, let's say, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway. But there's also other countries in Europe like France and Italy and the UK that have also pulled back for gender affirming care. So that there has been a very notable withdrawal and kind of curtailment around gender affirming care. It has caused a huge amount of controversy, and the argument has become very, very heightened. But I think finally it's got into the mainstream. We've been speaking about it for some years, and we didn't used to get much attention in the mainstream, but more and more the mainstream are becoming a little bit they're becoming a little bit behind the wave, and the online media is starting to kind of beat arguably the mainstream media. Is quite noticeable, as well as that we saw that with, let's say, Donald Trump going on Joe Rogan. It felt like a mark and a line in the sand of the kind of the online media was starting to become more mainstream than the mainstream media. It was fascinating to see that. So I think that there's a new wave of media coming out, and they are embracing the fact that there is huge issues with gender affirming care. It's based on shoddy science. It's based on really shoddy academia. And it's anybody who's well informed realizes that. And anybody who isn't informed is starting to, I think, become a lot less confident in their positions than they used to be.
So, I mean, you've brought this up. I mean, if you start to dig into this, I mean, these studies that were supporting this, low sample sizes, sloppy methodology, huge dropout rate, it was evident if you kind of look into it. But for some reason, some of the smartest people in the world got duped into this. All of our profession of therapy, as well as psychology, psychiatry, medicine, it was people who went to prestigious institutions and universities with lots of letters behind their names. How did the smartest people in the world get duped by this?
So fascinating. I've kind of two reasons that jump to mind with this. One is there's something about trans that people kind of equate it to being gay or lesbian, that people presume it's kind of akin to something you're born with. There's nothing you can do about it. It's very like being gay or lesbian, and therefore we've just got to roll with it. It's gay part 2. And frankly, we embarrassed ourselves with gay part 1 when people were ostracized and many lives were ruined. So we're going to just be impressive the second time around. It doesn't hold water for very much thought, because if you think about it, being gay, it doesn't require any medical interventions. It is found in the animal world. Being gay is something that, requires consenting partners, but it doesn't require participation from the rest of the world. You could be gay in the year 2000 BC. You could be gay in the year 500. While medical transition as a technology has only been around in the last 100 years. So people could be gender nonconforming, as I was. I looked like a boy. You could be gender nonconforming for thousands of years, but you couldn't actually medically transition. So therefore, if it was true that if people didn't medically transition, they would die, well, then surely, because the rates of medical transition were so low until the last 10 years, surely there'd be thousands upon hundreds of thousands of suicides because of transition. And surely there would be an awful lot of suicide notes that would be saying, this is why I'm dying by suicide, is because I can't transition, or I wanted to be a boy. They would be saying it in different ways, but none of that is happening. And so there is a huge amount of literature of people being gay and lesbian for thousands of years. There isn't the equivalent. There's gender nonconforming, which is a completely different thing. That's people who, like me, wanted to be a boy and they look different. It's reliant upon stereotypes. It's not about medical transition. That's a different thing. That's kind of changing your body and, getting phalloplasty and having mastectomies. They weren't available as interventions up until, like I say, the last 100 years, and especially in the last 50 years. They just weren't available in history. So this idea that it's always been with us is a fallacy. Gender nonconformity has been always with us. Secondly, is a kind of, among cerebral people, clever people, they seek out utopias, they seek out solutions for life. They like to seek large frameworks such as socialism, or, communism, or they like to seek large scale solutions for mankind. That might be an electric rail system, or it might be electricity, or it could, it could be amazing things that are seeking resolution. And in a way, there's something extraordinary, cerebrally attractive that you can make yourself. You can create yourself. Do you understand me? That you can be a new person. There's something attractive to very clever people about that. And it requires mental gymnastics. So these very clever people, I think there's two things going on there. They're kind of attracted to the magnitude of the event of medical transition to become a different person, as well as that they think it's kind of like being gay anyway. And so I don't want to embarrass myself. And they've merged those two things, and they've just, I would say they have become mindlessly attuned to this idea that you could be born in the wrong body. And I'm like, born in the wrong body? Like, we are born as our bodies. And when our bodies die, we die as our bodies. I didn't have any other body that I could have chose to be born into. It's an asinine concept. But people are, like I say, clever people do mental gymnastics to convince themselves of things. And they like large-scale, intelligent solutions. And this has the allure of being one of them.
I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think this almost has the feel of like a spirituality or a religion. With gay, it was kind of like, I'm sexually attracted to men. No one really doubted. People said, I think that's immoral, but no one really doubted that you were like deceiving them.
Sexually attracted to men. Yeah.
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 But with the trans thing, you're making this kind of supernatural claim that regardless of what you see on my exterior, my biology, I literally am a woman. And you're some type of fascist if you disagree. I think it was Helen Joyce who said this is like a secular version of a soul. There really is some time like a higher order, like religious type mentality here, it seems like.
It's very like a religion, and I think it's very, very relevant that the trans phenomenon emerged in our kind of post-religious age. That in many levels, certainly, for example, Ireland would be a good example. Like, I was born and raised a Catholic, and every single class, it's amazing to think of it, for every single class, so we had a class every 40 minutes, and for every single class we had to stand up and say a prayer, and that was perfectly normal. So every 40 minutes we'd stand up and say a prayer. That was perfectly normal in the teenager in Ireland. So that's how religious we were, if you follow me. So, 9 prayers every single day at the start of every class. And then we kind of, I would say, kind of very fast order, we lost an awful lot of religion. You know what I mean? And a lot of communities did. And I would say that there was a huge vacuum left in this post-religious age. I particularly think that an awful lot of anxious people seek out religious systems because there's something my own mother would be very religious, and she says it's a great comfort to me. My faith is a great comfort to me. And it makes sense. The idea, you know what I mean, that there is a higher order looking out for you. It's very comforting. And I do think that people who were left without a religious kind of, even if they went against their own religion that they were brought up with, there's something comforting about the idea of trans being the new kind of way of living. And so I do think it is like a kind of a secular religion. And it does seem to have this idea of the kind of the soul, that there's a soul within you. And that soul is either pink or blue or non-binary. And it is the real you. And this concept that there's some sort of deep, true, real you, which is very like a soul again. And it does make one think about, who are you and who am I and who is the real me? Is the real me when I was 10 or when I was 20 or now? Is there a real me, or am I continuously just layered upon? Is there an essence of me that will live on forever? And is that essence male or female or non-binary? These are huge questions that I don't think anybody has really answered, but it does feel that it's very relevant to the post-religious age, that suddenly a new idea of a soul has emerged.
Yeah, you brought up non-binary, and I think that's a really interesting one because if it's a binary trans issue, you at least have a frame of reference to know what you're talking about. Like, I'm a man who, they wouldn't frame it like this, but we would understand it as I'm a man who's pretending to be a woman, and I want to take hormones and have surgeries to put on a very convincing costume. Like, we would understand that. When it comes to non-binary, we've kind of lost all of our frame of reference. You've got people identifying as cartoon characters, space aliens, wolves, dragons. I saw anxiety-gender the other day, a gender that's anxiety is your gender. How do you conceptualize this non-binary framework?
Yeah, I've heard of fawn gender, like a fawn in the
Like a
forest.
deer?
Yeah, I think, uh, I think it's very important that we realize an awful lot of people who are identifying out of the gender are distressed people, vulnerable people who often have other mental illnesses and are often finding it difficult to relate to other people. I think it's very important that we realize that when you cannot relate to other people, you could identify out of being human because you're not really feeling like you belong. So I think it really raises huge issues about the person's feeling of alienation from society, a feeling of not part of things, not part of a community, not part of people. I think, as a psychotherapist or a counselor, it's incredibly important that we don't collude in the client's attempt to be dehumanized because we are fundamentally human. And that's what I offer as a therapist. I offer, the human connection. And if they are putting up blocks to their humanity by identifying out of being human, for example, fawn gender or lion gender or wind gender, there's this new kind of gender where they can shape the wind, and Therians, a lot of people are identifying as animals. And I'm like, yeah, that's dehumanizing yourself. Let's look into why you are feeling dehumanized and so alienated from humanity, because that's very distressing. It's a profoundly distressing feeling. The idea that adults and experts are colluding with these deeply distressed people into saying, yeah, you aren't human. Yeah, I'll buy into wolf gender. It's an indictment on anybody who knows anything about psychology, because these people need a lot of help. That's what I would say. They need a lot of help. But the beginning of the non-binary was, in a way, I remember when I was a kid and I wanted to be a boy. And the question that followed me my whole childhood was, are you a boy or a girl? Everywhere I went, are you a boy or a girl? Are you a boy or a girl? And I hated the question, to be honest. But very often I just answered no, which which in a way was non-binary. I reject. No. I often think of that with non-binary. They're kind of throwing their fingers up to the world. They're like, no. And I'm like, yeah, they don't want to be pink. They don't want to be blue. They don't know what they are, but they don't like stereotypical versions of men and stereotypical versions of male and female. So they're rejecting it. And fair enough. You know what I mean? Some people are very feminine. Some people are very masculine. And males are masculine and women who are feminine, God bless them, they're kind of lucky enough to find it easy. There's a lot of people who just find it difficult. Why is it that some boys want to run around wearing dresses? Why is it that some girls are very masculine? We haven't quite figured that out, but they've always been there. There's a small number of them. And if some of them are just going, I don't, like, for example, just to add to the point, a lot of these girls don't feel pretty enough to be a girl. A lot of these boys don't feel masculine enough to be a man. So they don't feel like they're cutting it in a world where they have high expectations. It's a highly sexualized world, and there's high expectations of what it is to be a girl, to be a teenage girl, to be a woman. Equally so for men. They don't like the little kind of wimpy little boy, and he just feels. Do you remember? I remember looking at my brother, who was a little bit older than me, and he was very small. I remember thinking he could never be a man. It's not possible. They're so small and weedy, and I can understand how little boys think I'd never be a man. And the same for the girls. Like never. I remember it felt like so foreign and unlikely. I can just see how these people might just think, I can't even, I'm out. Non-binary, that's me. I'm out of this race. I can't beat that because I'll never succeed. I'll never be able for it. That's my read of it. I think you could have a lot of psychological readings of it. Any but you really are a wolf spirit and we have to give you milk on a dish on the ground. No, I don't buy into dehumanizing people.
If we could step back for a second, when you look kind of broadly at the field of psychotherapy, could you talk about the influence of political bias?
Yeah, psychotherapy has really disappointed me. In many ways, I feel like a priest who's lost his faith with psychotherapy because I feel it has become politicized, just like the media has become politicized. Psychotherapy has presumed that there is certain political views that are right and some that are wrong, and it has allowed a kind of a political bias to kind of enter into the field. And I'm very sad because we are standing on the shoulders of giants. The great psychologists of the past, they were very critically rigorous, deep thinkers who would have penetrated any political affectation or bias, and they would have said, but that's not what you bring into the room when you're a psychologist or a psychotherapist. What you bring into the room is a neutral, open demeanor that leaves behind your politics. It leaves behind your childhood experiences, and it brings to the table your great knowledge that you've acquired through the study of the mind. That's what you bring to the table. You don't bring your politics, but somehow, as a part of this kind of sleight of hand that we've been turned into supporters rather than psychologists, there has been a kind of presumption that we bring our whole self to work, if you follow me. So we bring our political bias to work. We bring everything we have into our workplace. And I don't think that serves the client. I really think it's a disservice to the client.
Can you tell me what Genspect is doing at the moment and what's on the horizon for you?
Yeah, Genspect is very exciting and exhausting organization to work for. We are running a brilliant conference, may I say, at the end of September in Albuquerque in New Mexico. We've got some brilliant speakers. Just off the top of my head, people like, I don't know, do you know J.D. Haltigan, the psychologist?
Oh,
He's
yeah, I love
brilliant,
him. Yeah.
Yeah, he's great. Logan Lansing, who wrote The Queering of the American Child. Adam Coleman, who writes beautifully about parenting and, the difficulties of parenting in America. Lionel Shriver, I don't know, she's a brilliant writer, yeah. We've got some brilliant, absolutely brilliant leading lights. Lisa Lippman, who was the first person to coin the term ROGD, Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria. She'll be speaking as well. So we've got all the heavyweights too. Yeah, that conference is very big on our agenda this year, and you can get your tickets by looking up Genspect. Another big event for us in Genspect is we're going to have, through Pitchstone Publishing, we're going to have our first book released. And the book offers a framework for a non-medicalized approach to gender dysphoria. And it offers a framework to schools, to clinics, to hospitals, to youth centres, to sports clubs, to prisons, to hospitals, how we can understand that you need to prioritise sex over gender and the need to offer a non-medicalised approach to gender dysphoria. That, when you come to, let's say, female prisons, we have to prioritise a person's biological sex over their gender identity because of safety matters. And so we delve into the conflict of rights that happen when one woman says, I'm a woman and I don't want to share a cell with a male who identifies as a woman. And we go into the kind of the thinking behind that with the gender framework. So that is going to be published this year, and we're so excited to have an actual book that will help all over America. This is going to help all the schools and the clinics and stuff like that. And I know, Trump's executive orders have come in, but they need to be supported by well thought out frameworks. And I think this gender framework is going to really, really help people in the US. So they're the two big events that jump to my mind. And the third one is that we are bringing forth a memorandum of understanding on the role of puberty in adolescence, which is a kind of a statement of principle that people can sign from all over the world, organizations can sign, and they can put it on their website as kind of, we advocate for the role of puberty in adolescence. And we believe that the puberty should be protected as a very important, crucial stage of the child to go from adolescence to adulthood. They need to go through puberty. And if you stop their puberty and then you somehow chemically induce what isn't puberty, because it doesn't, begin the reproduction cells, but it's chemically induced transition, well, then you are negating the right of the child to go through their natural puberty, and that is a human right that they need to have protected.
Are you, when you look at the trans issue, are you optimistic looking forward?
Moderately. I think it's becoming more and more to the point that it is not even defensible to medically transitioned children. I think people have, the mainstream, once they cotton on to what is actually happening when you medically transition children, they realise this is barbaric. And I think we can expect across the world over the next few years an acknowledgement that that was an infringement on the human rights of the child. I think, I'm very, very, very optimistic about that. I think medical transition as a failed intervention, which I believe it is for vulnerable adults, I think that will take some time, and I think that will go on and on and on. Specifically in the US, I'm a little bit less optimistic than across the world, because I believe it's become incredibly polarized in the US between red and blue, and I think it's going to inevitably be red states and blue states, sanctuary states. And I think it's going to continue to be weaponized for as long as the Democrats continue to weaponize medical transition as some sort of human right that they need to uphold, and it's a democratic issue. For as long as that continues, I think there's going to be some very dark days for America. We've seen it already, let's say with the gun laws and the abortion rights, that they have made these political positions that are making people immovable. And, I don't know what's the way forward. And I'm not saying I'm taking a position on those things. I'm saying once it becomes weaponized by one side or the other, it becomes intransigent and people can't move out of their red or blue situation. And I fear the exact same is going to happen now with trans rights. And that makes me very worried.
Wow. So we talked a lot about how psychotherapy and psychology have gone off the rails. How do you fix those professions?
I said earlier we're standing on the shoulders of giants. I do think it's true. I think, psychology has great critical rigor behind it. We actually have great evidence base. We have great supporting kind of thought processes and theories we have had control groups. We've had lots of trials. There has been a lot of theory that has been tested. And what has happened is there's just been a lot of new approaches that are very influenced by a kind of consumer-based medicine. And I think we need to kind of revert to taking pride in the process that we can offer. I think we need to regain our confidence as psychotherapists and psychologists and say, I've got something valuable to offer, and it's not as a facilitator. That's not my job. My job is something deeper than that, and it's more difficult than that, but it's also arguably more valuable than that because it's harder. I worry probably more about the profession of psychology and psychotherapy than I do about the trans issue. I think the trans issue is coming to light. I think psychotherapists have left the industry, and I think what's left is an awful lot of people who just think reflexively being kind in the short term is my only role. Don't feel that there are as many deep thinkers in this context, and I worry a lot about it.
What would you say to a young person, say, approaching puberty or just starting puberty, who, like you, felt uncomfortable about their gender? Maybe they feel uncomfortable in their body and they're thinking like, maybe transition is what, I know something's wrong with me. Maybe transition is what's going to fix me. What would you say to this person?
I'd say a lot. I'd say a lot to that person. I'd say, there's probably nothing more alluring in life than to think you can be a different person. And let's look at the old person. Let's look at the person you don't want to be, the old you. And let's figure out why you loathe that person. Why do you want to leave that person? What do they represent? What happened to that person that you want to move away and become a different person? And tell me about the new person you want to be. Let's look at that person. Who is that person? And can you become that person without medication? And if you need medication to be that person, what does that mean? And what happens when the medication loses its power? Because medication almost always does. So what are we going to do then? Because you're going to be still at heart. There's somebody there, the essence. And can we somehow integrate these two people? The old you that you hate and this new you that you want to become? Because it's very proud and noble of this young person to want to become a great person. It's very endearing. And I'd love to help them become a great person. But let's see if we can do it without medication.
That's beautiful. I have one question left for you, and that is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
I think for me, the big issue is, what I spoke about earlier, which is the rights-based versus evidence-based. I don't think people realize that that's what has happened to medicine. And I think people don't realize that they are arguing one side of the coin or the other. And they don't realize this has become a completely politicized issue where the left and the Democrats presume that I have to argue for the human right of everybody to have any care they want. So if they have terminal anorexia and they want to die, that is their right. And I think that should be penetrated a lot more, that this is a political position and it isn't necessarily the best for the individual. Maybe the individual would be better off with expert care. And so I think we're missing. I went into it in this because thank you, you gave me the space to talk about it. But as a rule, I don't think we're talking about that. We saw it during COVID. The World Health Organization, I think, didn't cover itself in glory around COVID. But this right, I have the right to do this and the right to do that and the right to do the other around medication and like vaccines and things like this. It all became, it's wrecking the heart of medicine.